Shalom to my dear friends from around the world. This week we will be beginning reading in the synagogue the book of Exodus. So I wanted to share with you some thoughts from the very beginning of the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus is the book of redemption. The book that begins with the enslavement in Egypt, and it concludes with two major points: the giving of the Torah, the receiving of the Torah, the Ten Commandments on the Mount of Sinai, and the establishment of the tabernacle. The tabernacle that continues and leads in the center of the people of Israel all the way till they arrive to the land of Israel. So today I want to study the first chapter of the book of Exodus, a chapter which brings us and dives us right in to the story of the enslavement of the people of Israel. But it begins with the first 7 verses, which connect us to the book of Genesis. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each man and his household came: Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. Now all those descended from Jacob were 70 souls. Joseph was in Egypt. Now Joseph died, as well as his brothers, and all that generation. The children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and increased and became very, very strong, and the land became filled with them. We see here that the opening story of the book describes two opposing processes, one which leads to the other. The first process is the astonishing multiplication of the people of Israel. A family of 70 souls becomes, in relatively a very short time, a great nation. This process of strengthening the size of the nation and its rate of growth is perceived by Pharaoh as a threat to the Egyptian nation. And this gives rise to the second process, aimed at halting their continued growth. And so a family that was close to the Egyptian throne, and which had as a result enjoyed a special favor, quickly becomes an oppressed and enslaved minority, facing a real threat of annihilation. But at the beginning, the Torah begins with these 7 verses that I just read before. Although these verses repeat what we read at the end of the book of Genesis, but there are some differences between the parallel accounts at the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus. 2 differences in particular indicate the new setting of the book of Exodus. The first one is we see in verse 6, now all these descended from Jacob were 70 souls, now Joseph died, as well as his brother and all that generation. In the book of Genesis, Joseph died and all his brothers. And at the end and the beginning of this book, it says all his brothers and all that generation. These are few words that bring us forward a whole generation. The second difference is the order of the names. In the book of Genesis, the names are brought in the order of, it begins with Leah's children, and then her midwife, Bilhah, and then it goes on to the children of Rachel and her advisor, her midwife, Bilhah. I mean, first Leah and Zilpah, then the children of Rachel and Bilhah. Here it goes by the order. It goes by Leah's child and Rachel's child, and then it goes by the midwives. We're talking about a family that's becoming a nation. In the nationhood, the children of Rachel and the children of Leah are on a higher in the bureaucracy, on the hierarchy. But I want to point out another point. In the book of Exodus, we just read in verse 7, the children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and increased and became very, very strong, and the land became filled with them. In the parallel verse, in the book of Genesis, chapter 47, in verse 27, it says as follows: and the Israel dwelled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they took possession of it, and they were fruitful, and they multiplied greatly. Whereas in the book of Exodus, it says that the children of Israel were fruitful, they increased abundantly, they multiplied, and they grew exceedingly might, and the land was filled with them. The process described in the book of Exodus is far more intense compared. They were fruitful, and they were fruitful, and they increased abundantly. They multiplied greatly and grew exceedingly might. As a result of the huge increase in the book of Exodus, the geographical boundaries of their settlement in Goshen are overrun, and the land was filled with them. What we are seeing here, that after the transitional section in the first 7 verses, verse 8 opens up with a new story, a new era, and there's a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This begins the story of the decrees against the Jewish people. Where does this section end? Of course, at the end of verse 22, where we see the concluding of the story. But the image of Israel, as conveyed in this chapter, is cold and gray. No description of nature or appearance, without any individual characters, without no outstanding personality, simply an oppressed, suffering mass devoid of heroes. Chapter 2, of course, is the opposite. Here we see the background and the colorless of the faceless mass, one family, etc., etc. But let's look at the story we are seeing here in the story of the decree. And we'll try to see the structure of the story. There are 2 types of decree described in this story. One decree attempts to deal with the increasing numbers of the people of Israel. And the second decree, the death sentences of all the newborn, is a direct means of limiting them through murder. This cruel turning point in Pharaoh's decree takes place in verse 15, when Pharaoh talks to the midwives and tells them exactly. He says exactly in verse 15. We see, read it again, verse 15. Now the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. One was named Shifra and the second was named Puah. The first half, from verse 8 till verse 14, serves as a backdrop to the story, contains 3 issues. Pharaoh's word to the nation, the decree to build the treasure cities, and the decree of hard labor. In verse 9 and 10, we have Pharaoh's words to the nation. In verse 11 and 12, we have the decree to build the treasure cities. And in verse 13 and 14, we have the decree of hard labor. What we see here, we have 2 different steps in the process. At the beginning, Pharaoh tells them to build cities. But it doesn't help, because as much as they would afflict them, so did they multiply. So what happens? The failure of this affliction leads to a new decree, hard labor. As it says in verse 13, and the Egyptians enslaved the children of Israel with back-breaking labor. No longer it's only taskmasters who are responsible for collecting the labor tax from the people of Israel. Now Egypt made the people of Israel serve. So we have 2 levels, two steps in this process. At first, they're told to do a specific thing to build a city. And second step, if the thing didn't work, comes the hard labor. In the second half of the story, we have the same thing. At first, Pharaoh talks to the midwives, and he says, you should kill all the boys. But they refuse. And Pharaoh asks them, and God rewards them. And finally, Pharaoh commands the entire nation in verse 22. This half, of course, contains again 2 levels. The process of the increase continues in spite of the fact that Pharaoh tells the midwives to kill the babies. It doesn't work. We find that it's not working. And what happens? Pharaoh tells his whole nation. So we have 2 halves of the story. Both halves, Pharaoh tries to offend, to oppress the Jews. First, it's giving them a command to build a city. Then it's hard labor. First, it's telling the midwives to kill the babies. Then he's telling his whole nation to kill the babies. So we have parallel between the 2 halves of the story are very obvious. We have 2 decrees designed to diminish the number of the Hebrews, the first through hard labor, the second by killing the male babies. Both decrees go through the same stages. The initial decree, the failure of this initial decree, the nation continues to multiply, and this decree in its second, more intensified form, and an open-end conclusion that does not tell us whether the second stage was successful. The relationship between the second stage of each decree and its initial stage is the same in both halves. Although the second stage is meant to achieve the same objective that was set in the first stage, but it is intensified in both ways. It inflicts more comprehensive harm on the people of Israel, and it reflects a transfer of the implementation of the decree from a select group appointed to harm the people of Israel, the taskmasters or the midwives, to the entire Egyptian nation. And so the first half, although through the introduction of labor tax for a defined purpose, implemented taskmasters, then hard labor, enslavement to Egypt, labor in all spheres. The second half, first secretly killing the male newborns by the midwives, the second time publicly killing all newborns. What is the idea behind the structure of the story? We said there are two opposite processes taking place in our narrative. The first process of the internal increase of the people of Israel, and that is static from the point of view of the appearance of the story. It remains almost unchanging from the beginning of the story until the end. There are 7 expressions of multiplication of the people of Israel. But, as we said, the first stage doesn't work and it continues on. But surprisingly, we have 2 women who express the concept of freedom. The book of Exodus begins with 2 midwives who are there to show that in spite of their endangering their lives, they know that the king of Egypt can kill them. They know and they understand and they're fearful of God. So nobody can say, listen, it's not my fault, I received the orders. These 2 midwives, Shifra and Puah, prove to us that the book of Exodus begins from human freedom, from human liberty to worship God. And then it will lead to the whole nation. The roots of redemption are already here. Pharaoh, the evil king, is trying to overcome the people of Israel. The people of Israel are saved. Saved thanks to 2 midwives who refused to surrender their moral values. We will continue. Meanwhile, Shalom from Jerusalem, and you're more than welcome to go into shalomjerusalem.org and partner with the Shalom Jerusalem Foundation in our Turning the Temple Mount to a House of Prayer for All Nations, and in our support with the Amitzim organization, the support of the widows and the orphans of Israel. We are studying here this week the relationship between parent and child, where the king of Egypt wants to destroy that relationship, and these 2 midwives save them. Shalom from Jerusalem.